"Mister, my children are orphaned," Martha McKinnon whispered with her dying breath, gripping Judge Cornelius Whitman's weathered hand as tuberculosis finally claimed her life in the makeshift clinic above Cedar Creek's general store. Those 6 words would haunt the frontier judge for weeks as he faced an impossible decision that would determine whether 3 innocent children lived or died in the harsh Arizona territory of 1887. Nobody wanted 3 kids in a town where survival was hard enough for adults, where winter was approaching fast and failed crops had left most families struggling to feed themselves. Tommy McKinnon, 12 years old and trying to be the man of the family, stood beside his mother's deathbed holding the hands of 8-year-old Mary and 4-year-old Samuel, all 3 children staring at the only authority figure in their small world with eyes that begged for a miracle that frontier justice rarely provided. What happened next would either doom these orphans to separation and almost certain death, or prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest pasts to offer hope when all seems lost. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Creek's Main Street as Judge Whitman prepared for the most difficult custody hearing of his 20-year career on the territorial bench. Martha McKinnon had been dead for 3 days, and her children were currently staying with Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the minister's wife who'd taken them in temporarily despite having 6 children of her own and a husband whose modest salary barely covered their family's basic needs. The arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely, not with winter approaching and food supplies running dangerously low throughout the community after the summer's drought had destroyed most of the local wheat and corn crops. Judge Whitman had spent those 3 days discreetly approaching every family in Cedar Creek about the possibility of adoption, but the responses had been uniformly sympathetic and utterly hopeless. The Hendersons already had 4 children and were struggling to make ends meet on their small farm. The Coopers had recently lost their eldest son to scarlet fever and couldn't bear the thought of taking responsibility for more children they might fail to protect. The Williamses were expecting their first child and felt unprepared to handle 3 traumatized orphans along with their own upcoming challenges of new parenthood. The harsh reality of frontier life was that charity was a luxury most families simply couldn't afford, no matter how much they might want to help. Children required food, clothing, medical care, and education, all of which cost money that was in desperately short supply in Arizona territory. Moreover, taking in orphans meant accepting responsibility for their physical and emotional well-being in a land where diseases, accidents, and violence could claim lives without warning. Most frontier families had learned through bitter experience that survival required focusing their limited resources on their own blood relatives rather than extending themselves for strangers, no matter how deserving those strangers might be. The only viable option appeared to be the territorial orphanage in Phoenix, a 3-day journey through some of the most unforgiving desert terrain in the American Southwest. Judge Whitman had visited the facility once, years earlier, and the memory still haunted his dreams. Children were packed into overcrowded dormitories with inadequate food, minimal education, and virtually no individual attention. Disease spread rapidly through the population, and mortality rates were staggering, particularly among younger children who struggled to adapt to institutional life after losing their families. Sending the McKinnon children to Phoenix would almost certainly mean separating them permanently, as the orphanage's policy was to place children with different families as quickly as possible to reduce their operating costs. Tommy McKinnon understood the gravity of their situation with the premature wisdom that frontier life forced upon children who wanted to survive. At 12, he'd been helping his mother manage their small household since his father's death from a mining accident 2 years earlier, and he knew exactly how precarious their position had become. Martha had supported her family by taking in laundry and sewing, but her illness had made it impossible for her to work during the final months of her life. Their small savings had been exhausted paying for medicine and Dr. Henderson's visits, leaving the children with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the few pieces of furniture in their rented cabin. Mary McKinnon, 8 years old with her mother's gentle brown eyes and stubborn chin, had tried to take over the household duties as her mother grew weaker, but she was too young and small to manage the heavy work that frontier life demanded. She could cook simple meals and help with basic cleaning, but she couldn't chop wood, haul water from the well, or handle the dozens of other tasks that were necessary for survival in Arizona territory. Her efforts to care for her little brother Samuel while nursing their dying mother had earned the admiration of every woman in Cedar Creek, but admiration wouldn't put food on the table or keep them warm during the bitter desert nights that marked winter in the high country. Samuel McKinnon was barely 4 years old, too young to fully understand that his mother was never coming back, but old enough to sense that something terrible had happened to his safe, familiar world. He clung to Tommy and Mary with desperate intensity, crying inconsolably whenever they left his sight for even a few minutes. The trauma of watching his mother waste away from tuberculosis had left him withdrawn and fearful, prone to nightmares that woke the entire Patterson household. Mrs. Patterson had done her best to comfort the child, but she was already overwhelmed by her own responsibilities and couldn't provide the specialized attention that Samuel desperately needed to heal from his emotional wounds. Judge Whitman was reviewing his notes one final time when the courthouse door opened with a squeal of rusty hinges, admitting a figure that made every person in the small frontier courtroom turn to stare. Elijah Stone stepped into the room with the confident stride of a man who'd spent decades commanding respect through reputation and force of will, his weathered face showing no emotion as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Stone was tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that missed nothing important, dressed in the practical clothing of a successful rancher, but wearing his gun with the casual ease of someone who'd used it professionally for many years. Elijah Stone was a legend in Arizona territory, though the stories told about him varied dramatically depending on who was doing the telling. Some claimed he'd been one of the deadliest gunfighters in Texas before disappearing into the desert 20 years earlier, wanted for killing a sheriff's son in a duel over a woman's honor. Others insisted he'd been a lawman himself, driven to vigilante justice after losing his family to Comanche raiders and finding no satisfaction in the official legal system. What everyone agreed on was that Stone had built one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory through a combination of shrewd business sense, ruthless determination, and a reputation for violence that discouraged rustlers and claim jumpers from testing his resolve. "Your Honor," Stone said in his gravelly voice, removing his hat respectfully as he approached the bench where Judge Whitman sat with the McKinnon children's file spread before him. "I understand you're looking for someone to take responsibility for the McKinnon children. I'm here to volunteer for that responsibility." The simple statement sent ripples of shocked whispers through the small courtroom, as nobody had expected the territory's most notorious recluse to involve himself in community affairs, particularly something as personal as child-rearing. Judge Whitman's weathered face showed complete shock at Elijah Stone's unexpected declaration, his gavel frozen halfway to the bench as he processed what the territory's most notorious recluse had just proposed. The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of desert wind rattling the windows and the nervous shuffling of feet as every person present tried to comprehend why a man who'd avoided human contact for 2 decades was suddenly volunteering to become a father to 3 traumatized orphans. Stone stood motionless in front of the bench, his pale blue eyes fixed on the judge with the patient intensity of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for the world to catch up with his thinking. "Mr. Stone," Judge Whitman said carefully, setting down his gavel with deliberate precision while his mind raced through the legal and practical implications of this development. "I appreciate your interest in the McKinnon children's welfare, but surely you understand that raising 3 children requires more than good intentions. These aren't cattle or horses that can be managed through firm handling and adequate feed. They're traumatized human beings who need stability, education, and emotional support that, frankly, given your background, I'm not certain you're equipped to provide." Stone's expression didn't change at the judge's diplomatic reference to his violent past, but something flickered in those pale eyes that suggested he'd expected exactly this kind of resistance. "Your Honor, I've got a working ranch with adequate housing, steady income from cattle sales, and 20 years of experience surviving in this territory without depending on anyone else for help. These children need food, shelter, and protection, all of which I can provide better than most folks in Cedar Creek." His voice carried the flat certainty of someone stating obvious facts rather than making emotional appeals. The murmur of concerned voices that rippled through the courtroom reflected the community's deep reservations about placing innocent children with a man whose reputation was built on violence and isolation. Mrs. Patterson, still caring for the children temporarily, rose from her seat with the kind of respectful determination that marked frontier women who'd learned to speak their minds when children's welfare was at stake. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Stone, but there's more to raising children than keeping them fed and housed. These little ones have lost everything they've ever known, and they need someone who understands how to heal emotional wounds, not just physical ones." Tommy McKinnon, sitting between his siblings in the front row, studied Stone with the suspicious intelligence of a 12-year-old who'd learned to evaluate adults based on their potential for providing or threatening his family's survival. The boy had heard the stories about Stone's past, had listened to the whispered conversations about gunfights and blood feuds that had driven the rancher into self-imposed exile. But Tommy also noticed details that the adults seemed to miss. The way Stone's eyes softened slightly when they rested on little Samuel, the careful respect in his posture as he addressed the judge, the absence of the casual cruelty that marked truly dangerous men. Mary McKinnon pressed closer to her older brother, her 8-year-old mind struggling to process the possibility that this intimidating stranger might become their new guardian. Stone was unlike any adult she'd ever encountered, radiating a kind of controlled power that made her think of the mountain lions that sometimes prowled the edges of town. But there was something else in his weathered features, a loneliness that she recognized because it matched the emptiness she felt since her mother's death. Maybe, Mary thought with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possessed, maybe Stone needed a family as much as they needed a protector. Samuel McKinnon, still too young to understand the complexities of the situation, had fallen asleep against Tommy's shoulder despite the tension filling the courtroom. The 4-year-old's exhaustion was complete, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from weeks of fear and uncertainty about his future. His small face was peaceful in sleep, unmarked by the worry lines that had begun appearing around his eyes since their mother's illness, and Stone found himself staring at the child with an expression that few people in Cedar Creek had ever seen on his face. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, his legal mind working through precedents and procedures while his heart wrestled with the impossible choice between an imperfect solution and almost certain disaster. Stone's offer was unprecedented in his experience, but so was the complete absence of any other viable options for keeping the children together. The territorial orphanage remained their only alternative, and everyone in the courtroom knew what that meant for the McKinnon siblings' chances of survival, let alone their prospects for remaining a family unit. "Mr. Stone," the judge said finally, his voice carrying the weight of years spent making decisions that affected people's lives in irreversible ways. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need honest answers, not what you think I want to hear. First, why are you doing this? You've lived alone for 20 years, avoided community involvement, and built your entire life around independence. What's changed that makes you want to take responsibility for 3 children you've never met?" Stone was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the judge to the children and back again as he considered how much truth the situation required. 20 years ago, I lost my own family to Comanche raiders while I was away on business. My wife Sarah and our 2 children, a boy about Tommy's age and a girl just older than Mary. His voice remained steady, but the courtroom could hear the old pain that still edged his words. I've spent 2 decades telling myself that avoiding attachments would prevent that kind of loss from happening again. But watching these children face the same kind of destruction I lived through, maybe it's time I stopped running from the possibility of caring about someone. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, heavy with implications that went far beyond the immediate question of child custody. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened as she recognized the genuine grief in Stone's carefully controlled voice, and even Judge Whitman felt his professional skepticism wavering in the face of such raw honesty. This wasn't a man making an impulsive gesture or seeking to improve his community standing. This was someone who understood loss intimately and was willing to risk experiencing it again for the sake of 3 children who had nowhere else to turn. "Second question," Judge Whitman continued, though his tone had become less interrogational and more exploratory. "What do you know about children's emotional needs? These aren't just miniature adults who need food and shelter. They're traumatized, grieving, and will require patience and understanding that might not come naturally to someone with your professional background." The judge's careful phrasing acknowledged Stone's violent past without making direct accusations that might derail the conversation. I know I'm not qualified by any normal standard, Stone replied with characteristic bluntness. I know children need more than I can probably give them, and I know my past makes me a questionable choice for guardian. But I also know that separation and institutionalization will destroy whatever's left of their family. And I know that my ranch can provide them with safety and stability while they heal from losing their mother. I'm not promising to be a perfect father, Your Honor. I'm promising to do everything in my power to keep them alive and together until they're old enough to make their own choices about their futures. The honesty of Stone's self-assessment impressed even his critics in the courtroom, showing a level of self-awareness that contradicted the image of him as a mindless killer motivated only by violence and greed. Dr. Henderson, who treated Martha McKinnon during her final illness, rose to address the court with the kind of medical authority that carried significant weight in frontier communities. Your Honor, if I might speak on Mr. Stone's behalf, I can testify that he's been quietly supporting several widowed families in this community for years, providing beef and other supplies without seeking credit or recognition. Whatever his past might have been, his recent actions suggest a capacity for compassion that shouldn't be ignored. Dr. Henderson's unexpected endorsement sent another wave of surprised murmurs through the courtroom, as few people in Cedar Creek had been aware of Stone's quiet charitable activities over the years. The revelation that the territory's most notorious recluse had been secretly supporting struggling families added a completely new dimension to his character, challenging the community's assumptions about his capacity for human compassion. Judge Whitman made careful notes as several other respected citizens rose to offer similar testimonies about Stone's hidden generosity, painting a picture of a man who deliberately concealed his better nature behind a facade of dangerous indifference. Mr. Stone has been providing beef to the widow Campbell and her 4 children for over a year, testified Samuel Morrison, the owner of the general store who'd facilitated many of these anonymous donations. He always pays me to deliver the meat without mentioning his name, and when I asked him why he wanted to keep it secret, he said that charity works better when people don't feel beholden to their benefactors. The storekeeper's words carried the ring of truth that comes from first-hand observation rather than community gossip. Martha Henderson, the doctor's wife and one of the most respected women in Cedar Creek, stood to address the court with the moral authority that frontier communities granted to ministers and doctors' wives. Your Honor, I've had occasion to observe Mr. Stone's behavior around children during church socials and community gatherings. He's always careful to stay out of their way, but I've noticed that he watches them with a kind of wistful attention that suggests regret rather than discomfort. A man who truly disliked children wouldn't pay such close attention to their welfare. Judge Whitman found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about Elijah Stone as testimony after testimony revealed a pattern of quiet decency that contradicted the man's fearsome reputation. The gunfighter who terrorized claim jumpers and cattle thieves apparently had a soft spot for widows, orphans, and struggling families, though he'd gone to great lengths to hide this compassionate side of his nature from public recognition. The judge wondered if Stone's violent reputation was partially self-constructed, a deliberate persona designed to protect himself from the kind of emotional vulnerability that had destroyed him 20 years earlier. Tommy McKinnon had been listening to every word with the intense concentration of someone whose future hung in the balance, and he found himself studying Stone with new interest as the testimonies revealed unexpected depths to the man's character. The 12-year-old had developed survival instincts that allowed him to read adults accurately, and everything he observed about Stone suggested competence, reliability, and genuine concern for their welfare. More importantly, Stone's offer represented their only realistic chance of staying together as a family, which Tommy understood was worth almost any risk. Your Honor, Tommy said suddenly, his young voice cutting through the adult discussions with surprising authority. Might I be allowed to speak for my brother and sister? The boy's request caught everyone off guard, but Judge Whitman recognized the intelligence and determination in Tommy's eyes and nodded for him to continue. Frontier law often granted older children significant input into custody decisions, particularly when they demonstrated the maturity that harsh circumstances sometimes forced upon young people. Mr. Stone, Tommy said, turning to address the rancher directly with the kind of straightforward honesty that marked children who'd learned to cut through adult pretenses. My ma always taught us that a person's actions matter more than their reputation, and that good people sometimes have to do hard things to protect what they love. If you're willing to take responsibility for us, I'm willing to trust that you'll keep your word about keeping us together." The boy's simple statement carried more weight than all the adult testimony that had preceded it. Mary McKinnon nodded vigorous agreement with her brother's words, though she was too shy to speak publicly in the intimidating courtroom setting. Her 8-year-old instincts told her that Stone was different from the adults who'd offered sympathy but no practical help during their mother's illness, that his willingness to take them sight unseen demonstrated a kind of commitment that went beyond polite charity. She'd noticed how his eyes softened when he looked at little Samuel, and how he'd unconsciously moved to position himself between the children and the courtroom door, as if already assuming a protective role. Samuel stirred awake in his brother's arms, blinking sleepily around the room full of serious adult faces before his gaze settled on Stone with the kind of fearless curiosity that marked very young children who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. "Are you going to be our new papa?" he asked with 4-year-old directness, the innocent question cutting through all the legal complexities to address the emotional heart of the situation. Stone's careful composure cracked slightly at the child's words, revealing a glimpse of the pain and longing he'd been carrying for 2 decades. "If the judge says yes, and if you want me to be," Stone replied gently, his gruff voice softening in a way that surprised everyone who'd only known him as the territory's most dangerous man. "I can't promise to be as good as your ma was, but I can promise to do my best to take care of you and keep you safe." The simple honesty of his response resonated through the courtroom, showing a vulnerability that humanized him more effectively than any character witness could have managed. Judge Whitman spent several long minutes reviewing his notes and considering the unprecedented situation before him, weighing the risks of placing children with a man of questionable past against the certainty that separation would destroy their family unit forever. Stone's offer was far from ideal by conventional standards, but conventional solutions weren't available in their harsh frontier environment where practical survival often mattered more than social propriety. The judge had seen too many children disappear into territorial institutions never to be heard from again, and the alternative Stone represented at least offered hope for keeping the siblings together. "Mr. Stone," Judge Whitman said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would affect 4 lives in irreversible ways, "I'm going to grant you temporary custody of the McKinnon children for a period of 6 months, during which time you'll be expected to demonstrate your ability to provide appropriate care, education, and emotional support. Dr. Henderson will conduct monthly visits to assess their welfare, and any evidence of neglect or abuse will result in immediate removal of the children from your custody." The conditional nature of the arrangement provided some protection for the children while acknowledging the reality that Stone was their only viable option. Furthermore, the judge continued, "Mrs. Patterson has agreed to visit your ranch weekly to assist with domestic arrangements and provide guidance on child-rearing matters. The children will attend school in Cedar Creek during the appropriate seasons, and you'll be expected to participate in community functions that demonstrate your commitment to their social development." The conditions were designed to ensure that the children wouldn't become completely isolated on Stone's remote ranch, maintaining connections to the wider community that could monitor their welfare. Stone nodded acceptance of the terms without hesitation, understanding that the judge was trying to balance protection for the children with recognition of their desperate circumstances. "Your Honor, I accept all conditions of custody, and I give my word that these children will receive the best care I'm capable of providing. They'll never want for food, shelter, protection, or education while they're under my roof." The formal declaration had the weight of a sacred oath coming from a man whose word was considered absolutely reliable in business dealings throughout the territory. As the courtroom began to empty following the judge's decision, Stone approached the children with the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades avoiding emotional attachments and wasn't quite sure how to begin forming new ones. Tommy stood protectively in front of his siblings, still evaluating their new guardian with the wariness that had kept his family alive during their mother's illness. Mary clutched her cornhusk doll tighter, watching Stone with curious eyes that showed more hope than fear. Samuel reached out his small hand toward this tall stranger who'd just promised to become their father, displaying the trusting nature that had somehow survived his traumatic losses. "We should head out to the ranch before dark," Stone said practically, though his voice carried a gentleness that hadn't been there during his legal testimony. "It's about an hour's ride, and you'll want to see your new home while there's still daylight to get oriented." The simple statement marked the beginning of an unlikely family's journey together, for damaged souls attempting to heal each other in the vast loneliness of the Arizona desert. 6 months later, Judge Whitman rode out to the Stone Ranch for what he expected to be a routine custody evaluation. But what he discovered exceeded his most optimistic expectations for how this unconventional arrangement might develop. The remote homestead that had once been the domain of Arizona Territory's most notorious recluse had been transformed into something that looked remarkably like a thriving family farm, with children's laughter echoing across the desert valley and evidence of domestic life visible in every corner of the property. Tommy McKinnon was working alongside Stone to repair fence posts damaged by the recent winter storms, the 12-year-old boy moving with the confident competence of someone who'd found his place in the world and was proud of the work he was doing. Mary McKinnon emerged from the ranch house wearing a clean dress and carrying a basket of fresh bread, her face glowing with the kind of healthy contentment that marked children who felt secure in their environment and confident about their future. The 8-year-old girl had grown several inches during her time on the ranch, filling out from the thin, worried child she'd been during her mother's illness into someone who radiated the natural exuberance that should characterize childhood. She greeted Judge Whitman with polite enthusiasm, eager to show him the vegetable garden she'd planted with Stone's help and the new kittens that had been born in the barn just 2 weeks earlier. Samuel McKinnon, now almost 5 years old, came running around the corner of the house chasing a half-grown puppy with the kind of uninhibited joy that proved his emotional wounds had healed as completely as anyone could hope. The little boy showed no sign of the withdrawn fearfulness that had characterized him during the custody hearing, instead displaying the natural confidence of a child who felt completely secure in his family's love and protection. He launched himself into Stone's arms with absolute trust, chattering excitedly about the day's adventures and plans for tomorrow's activities. Stone himself had undergone a transformation that was almost as dramatic as the changes in the children, though his evolution had been more subtle and took longer for outsiders to recognize. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened with genuine smiles. His habitually tense posture had relaxed into something approaching contentment, and his voice carried warmth when speaking to or about his adopted children that replaced the careful emotional distance he'd maintained for 20 years. The feared gunfighter had discovered that protecting a family was far more satisfying than protecting only himself, and that the vulnerability of caring about others was worth the risk of potential loss. "Judge Whitman," Tommy called out as he spotted the visitor approaching, setting down his tools to walk over and shake hands with the adult respect that frontier life taught children to display toward authority figures. "Mr. Stone's been expecting you. He said you'd want to see how we've been getting along, and we've got plenty to show you." The boy's easy confidence and obvious affection for his guardian spoke volumes about how successfully the unusual family had adapted to their new circumstances. The ranch house itself told the story of their first 6 months together through dozens of small details that revealed how thoroughly their lives had become intertwined. Children's clothes hung on the line beside Stone's work shirts, evidence of domestic routines that had become as natural as breathing. The main room showed signs of evening activities, books for the children's education, Mary's sewing project, Tommy's whittling practice, and Samuel's collection of interesting rocks arranged carefully on a shelf that Stone had built specifically for the 4-year-old's treasures. "The children have been helping with every aspect of ranch operations," Stone explained to Judge Whitman as they toured the property together, his voice carrying the pride of a father discussing his offspring's accomplishments. "Tommy's got a natural talent for working with cattle, and he's already planning improvements to our water management system. Mary's taken over the vegetable garden completely and keeps us supplied with fresh produce year-round. Even Samuel helps with collecting eggs and feeding the chickens, and he's learning to read faster than I ever expected." The educational component of their arrangement had exceeded everyone's expectations, with Stone proving to be surprisingly effective as a teacher despite his lack of formal training. He'd ordered books from back east, arranged for weekly visits from the traveling preacher who provided religious instruction throughout the territory, and ensured that the children's academic progress matched or exceeded what they would have received in Cedar Creek's one-room schoolhouse. More importantly, He taught them practical skills that would serve them well in frontier life. Basic veterinary care, weather prediction, mechanical repair, and the 100 other competencies that marked successful homesteaders. The emotional bonds between Stone and the children had developed gradually but deeply, built on shared work, mutual respect, and the kind of patient understanding that comes from people who've all experienced significant loss. Stone never tried to replace their memories of their parents, instead helping them honor their mother's memory while building new traditions that belonged uniquely to their reconstituted family. The children called him Papa Stone rather than simply Father, acknowledging both his parental role and his distinct identity as someone who'd chosen to love them rather than being obligated by blood. Judge Whitman was particularly impressed by how Stone had handled the challenges that inevitably arose when traumatized children began feeling safe enough to express their grief and anger about their losses. Tommy had gone through a period of testing boundaries and authority, acting out in ways that might have driven a less patient guardian to return him to institutional care. Instead, Stone had responded with firm consistency tempered by understanding, helping the boy work through his feelings while maintaining the structure and expectations that children needed to feel secure. Mary had struggled with nightmares and anxiety attacks during her first months on the ranch, often waking the entire household with screams that brought back her terror about losing another parent. Stone had sat with her through countless difficult nights, never showing impatience or frustration with her emotional needs, gradually helping her understand that grief was natural and that healing took time. His willingness to share stories about his own losses had helped Mary feel less alone in her struggles, creating a foundation of mutual understanding that strengthened their relationship. Samuel's adjustment had been complicated by his young age and limited understanding of why his world had changed so dramatically, but Stone's patient presence had provided the consistency and security the little boy needed to begin trusting again. The daily routines of ranch life, the presence of animals that required care, and the gradual realization that his new family was permanent had slowly rebuilt Samuel's confidence in the stability of his environment. Stone's willingness to get down on the floor and play childish games, despite his fearsome reputation, had been crucial to winning the 4-year-old's complete trust and affection. The community's reaction to Stone's transformation had been mixed, with some residents expressing grudging admiration for his success as a guardian, while others remained skeptical about whether a former gunfighter could truly provide appropriate moral guidance for impressionable children. However, the evidence of the children's well-being was impossible to ignore, and even Stone's harshest critics had been forced to acknowledge that his unconventional family appeared to be thriving under his care. "The truth is, Judge," Stone said as they concluded their tour and settled on the ranch house porch to watch the children play with their puppy in the evening light, "these kids have taught me more about courage than 20 years of gunfighting ever did. It takes real bravery to open your heart again after it's been broken, to trust someone new when the people you loved most have been taken away. I thought I was doing them a favor by giving them a home, but they've given me something I didn't even realize I'd lost, a reason to believe in tomorrow." The 6-month evaluation period had been designed to protect the children from potential harm, but Judge Whitman realized as he prepared his final report that the real question wasn't whether Stone was capable of caring for the McKinnon children adequately, but whether the children were prepared to handle the responsibility of caring for a man who'd forgotten how to be part of a family until they'd reminded him. The symbiotic relationship that had developed between them suggested that healing could flow in both directions, that broken people could help mend each other when they committed to the patient work of building trust and love. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the children's laughter, Judge Whitman made his decision about the permanent custody arrangement. The unlikely family that had formed around shared loss and mutual need had proven that love could indeed conquer the harshest circumstances, that redemption was possible for people willing to risk vulnerability in service of something greater than their own protection. Stone's Ranch had become a place where wounded souls could heal together, where the past's pain could be transformed into tomorrow's hope through the simple act of choosing to care for each other despite the risks involved. 3 years later, when Stone officially adopted all 3 children and changed their last name to Stone, the ceremony took place in the same courthouse where Judge Whitman had first granted temporary custody to Arizona Territory's most unlikely father. Tommy Stone was 15 and planning to study engineering so he could improve irrigation systems throughout the territory. Mary Stone was 11 and already showing talent as an artist, with several of her drawings hanging in the general store where travelers could admire her depictions of desert wildlife. Samuel Stone was 7 and completely convinced that his Papa Stone was the smartest, strongest, and best father any boy could possibly have. The adoption hearing drew spectators from throughout the territory, people who'd followed the story of the gunfighter who'd learned to love and the orphans who'd taught him how. Judge Whitman, now preparing for retirement after decades of frontier service, called it the most satisfying legal decision of his entire career. Stone himself said very little during the ceremony, but the tears in his eyes as he signed the final papers spoke louder than any words about what his children meant to him. That evening, as the newly official Stone family celebrated with a special dinner and homemade cake, Stone looked around his table at the 3 young people who transformed his lonely existence into something rich with purpose and joy. "You know," he told them quietly, "I spent 20 years thinking that love was too dangerous, that caring about someone just gave life more ways to hurt you. But you 3 taught me that the real danger is in not loving, in choosing safety over connection. I may have given you a home, but you gave me a life worth living." Years would pass, and the Stone children would grow up to become remarkable adults who carried their father's lessons about courage, commitment, and the transformative power of chosen family into their own lives and relationships. Tommy became a renowned engineer whose irrigation projects helped transform the Arizona desert into productive farmland. Mary's artwork captured the beauty and harsh majesty of the American West for audiences around the world. Samuel followed his father into ranching, eventually taking over the operation and expanding it into one of the territory's most successful cattle enterprises. But they never forgot the courthouse where a desperate woman's dying words had set in motion the chain of events that brought them together, or the judge who'd been brave enough to risk 3 children's lives on the possibility that even the most unlikely person could learn to love. The Stone family became legendary throughout Arizona Territory, not for gunfights or violence, but for proving that families could be built from courage, commitment, and the radical act of choosing to see potential rather than just problems in the people fate brings into our lives. This incredible story of courage, redemption, and the power of chosen family reminds us that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest pasts to offer hope when all seems lost. If Elijah Stone's transformation from feared gunfighter to devoted father moved your heart, please subscribe to our channel and smash that notification bell, because everyone needs to hear stories that show us love's power to heal even the deepest wounds. Share this beautiful tale of second chances with someone who needs to remember that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to love and protect each other no matter what. Tell me in the comments which moment touched you most: Stone's brave decision to adopt all 3 children, the children's courage in trusting him, or their beautiful evolution into a real family. Your engagement helps these powerful stories reach others who desperately need hope and inspiration. What story of unexpected love and redemption should we explore next? Remember, you are never too broken to love, and it's never too late to become the person someone else needs you to be.